Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 4th of December 2025, Adriana Clavel Vazquez and Jimena Clavel Vazquez, both from the University of Tilburg, share their grounds for skepticism about some of the standard accounts of how we draw cognitive and moral value from literature by identifying with or empathizing with characters whose experience and perspective on the world is significantly different from our own. The evidence suggests, they show, that our powers of imagination are severely limited in this respect, and it is better, they argue, to see that it is precisely our failure adequately to imagine the perspectives of others that yields an awareness of real difference, an awareness that we can also build on and strive to understand better. Good. Well, welcome everybody to the last of this term's Zoom seminars in aesthetic cognitivism and the prospects of criticism. We're very excited today because we have what I think it's fair to say is one of contemporary philosophy's most exciting double acts, and that is Adriana Clavel Vazquez and Jimena Clavel Vazquez in a co-authored paper on robustly embodied imagination and the limits. I beg your pardon. Failures of imagination in prophetic artworks. The title that I just blurted out mistakenly is a really great paper that they co-authored, which was published in Phil Studies a little while ago, and I think relates to what they're going to be talking about today. But we're super excited to have you both. If I understand correctly, Adriana's going to take the lead in presenting, but both will be here. Both are co-authors of the material, and Jimena will be equally available for questions afterwards. So without further ado, very much welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
No, thank you so much for having us. We are very excited to get some feedback on this paper because I think we have been working on it for what feels like a decade. So I think hopefully this will just give us the last push to get it done with and out. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so let me start with what we think, at least, is a very common and intuitive conception about the values of art, which is that particularly in turbulent times, we turn to art as a way to responding to moral crisis, as a way to confronting them. And for many people, it looks like art can fulfill this kind of role because it can offer us access to a deeper kind of understanding of other agents and of their circumstances. But we have found it interesting that actually in response to what might be some of the worst moral crises of our time, there are artists who actually reject this kind of picture and reject this kind of understanding. So for example, British writer Isabella Hamad explicitly rejects this kind of role for art, in particular for her for addressing the Palestinian genocide. And for her, she says, art should be taken to involve absolutely no answers and no moral instruction. And instead, she says, art should be taken to further disrupt our processes of sense-making. And so in recognizing the stranger, a lecture, she argues that art can actually do this disruption of sense-making by turning to anagnorisis. But in a very interesting reversal of what anagnorisis is traditionally taken to involve, she argues that recognition should instead focus on the epistemic limitations that just come as part of the fact that our perspectives are concrete, that they are subjective. And so the idea is that art offers an understanding not of our common humanity, but it's really about a recognition of the stranger qua stranger. And so if, we are left with this kind of picture, if art cannot offer understanding, if it cannot offer any kind of motivation of moral concern for others and for strangers, then what can art offer? And what she says is that art actually offers an acknowledgement of the precarity of knowledge. And so she says, this is the most I think we can hope for from novels. Not revelation, not the dawning of knowledge, but the exposure of its limit. To realize you have been wrong about something is, I believe, to experience the otherness of the world coming at you. And so our aim in this paper is to try to articulate this kind of picture. Um, the thing is that recent philosophical work on experiential imagination has actually focused on constraints in our perspective taking skills. And the kinds of limitations that this recent literature points to actually bring into question the traditional picture of the cognitive and ethical values of art that seems very intuitive. But what we want to do in this paper is to point out that actually, even if we focus on these kinds of limitations, there is an opportunity for, a value of art that resides in accessing this kind of understanding of otherness by dwelling on the limitations that are inherent to our concrete perspectives. And so the proposal is that if we are to understand the ethical and the cognitive values of art, we need to focus on this tension between imaginability and unimaginability. And so the plan for the rest of the talk is the following. In the next section, I'm going to very briefly go over the role that experiential imagination and perspective taking play in these very traditional picture of the values of art. And then in section 2, I'm briefly going to present the constraints on experiential imagination that have been discussed in recent literature and that stem from the role of this idea of situatedness and the role of the body in how we perform these kinds of exercises. And then I'm going to argue in section 3 that these constraints, again, challenge this common formulation of the values of art with which we are going to begin. So that in section 4, we're going to argue that actually these constraints just open up a different way of thinking about the values of art that follows from thinking about the value of the failures of imagination. Okay, so just to contextualize the paper, we are interested in a view about the values of art, according to which art can be taken to be both cognitively and ethically valuable insofar as it promotes a particular kind of understanding of the perspectives of others and a particular kind of understanding of their circumstances that can ultimately motivate moral concern for other agents. And of course, there are other formulations of the cognitive and the ethical values of art that might not be vulnerable to the issues that interest us today. So we're going to put those other formulations aside. But we just want to point out that the reason why we focus on this kind of picture for the values of art is that it seems to be a very intuitive way that appreciators use to articulate what is of value in art. So it's not just about what philosophers think, but also because we think that this kind of formulation is really trying to track a cognitive gain and an ethical gain that is best delivered by art, qua art. Okay. So in this traditional picture, the cognitive claim can be cashed out in what we think are 4 different but interrelated ways. So firstly, we might say that art offers appreciators experiential knowledge of what it is like to experience something or knowledge of what it is like for someone else. Secondly, we might say that art offers appreciators practical knowledge, right? We might think that it strengthens or it exercises appreciators' evaluative, mind reading, empathizing skills. Thirdly, we might say that art offers interpersonal understanding, an understanding of different perspectives, in the sense that it helps us make sense of the reasons why other agents might feel or think or act in the way that they do. And fourth, we might say that art offers moral understanding in the sense that it can help us grasp what counts morally. And from this kind of formulation about the cognitive value of art follows a view about the ethical value of art, according to which it can motivate moral concern for other agents. So firstly, we might say that art can help us see beyond ourselves. So for example, Iris Murdoch argues that art can offer access, she says, to the real quality of human nature, and that this departs from the self-centered rush of ordinary life. Secondly, we can say that art can contribute to the moral recognition of others. So for example, Nussbaum argues that literature can help us see the common humanity in others. And thirdly, we can say that art can contribute to the acknowledgement of other agents. So for example, John has argued that art can help us identify with the morally salient features of someone else's circumstances. Now, what we want to highlight in this very brief and rushed overview of this kind of picture about the cognitive and the ethical values of art is that actually underlying these ways of articulating these claims, there is the assumption that exercises of experiential imagination are at play. And so the idea is that when we engage with artworks, we're not just propositionally imagining that certain things are the case, but instead, art is in a position to offer these kinds of cognitive and ethical gains because it engages us as appreciators in this temporally extended and multifaceted exercise of imagination that includes not just this propositional component, but that includes also the sensory and experiential and affective and physiological and cognitive components. And so we think that it is in this sense that we might actually come, for example, come alive to these different patterns of value and come alive to the interests of other agents. Now, furthermore, it's not just that this picture assumes that we engage in these exercises of experiential imagination, but that this picture assumes that the cognitive and ethical gains depend on us imagining, experiencing these different circumstances from the perspective of someone who is not us. So for the engagement with art to result in, for example, the relevant cognitive gains, what it needs to involve is becoming attuned to patterns of value that we don't currently have, become attuned to interests that are not currently ours. And similarly, the ethical value of art, as is articulated before, also follows from this form of perspective taking. So it is by imaginatively inhabiting someone else's circumstances that I come to see beyond myself. It's by imaginatively inhabiting someone else's perspective that I come to see the common humanity of others, that I come alive to different patterns of value, and so on. So the idea is that ultimately, for art to have this kind of cognitive and ethical value, our engagement with art needs to involve what Peter Goldie has called empathetic imagining. So it's really about imagining being someone other, imagining being someone who has different interests, being someone who is responding to different patterns of salience, and not just someone who is facing different circumstances. And so the idea, again, is that the kind of exercise of imagination that is at stake is one that needs to summon someone else's cognitive and conative and affective and physiological states as if they were my own. However, this is where the problems come in, because it turns out that recent work on embodied imagination actually puts pressure on this idea that our imagination can deliver this kind of perspective-taking exercise. And the problems stem, for this picture of the cognitive and the ethical values of art, the problems stem from arguments that have been developed in the context of the kinds of constraints that operate on experiential imagination and empathy. And so the idea is that these kinds of arguments precisely bring into question if we're ever going to be successful in these exercises of perspective taking, because of how experiential imagination basically depends on one's body as it is situated in a very specific socio-historical context. So, for example, Iris Marion Young and Janine Jones argue that social positions prevent us from seeing relevant differences in situations that might look deceptively similar, especially if we are in a privileged positions. So they argue that perspectives are not actually reversible. And instead, they argue that to think that we can simply look at the world from a different perspective just involves completely ignoring that in oppressive circumstances, our interactions with the world and our interactions with other agents are not symmetrical. Now, we might acknowledge that this is a problem, but at the same time, we might still be tempted to push back against these concerns when it comes to art. Because we might think that, well, if we are left to our own devices, indeed, I might see these deceptively similar scenarios where there are no similarities. But in the case of artworks, we might think our perspective taking is actually a guided exercise of experiential imagination. We're not going at it alone. It's the artwork that is doing the heavy lifting. And what we want to, argue is that this actually doesn't leave us in a better position as appreciators, because the kinds of problems that are identified by these authors are not just a problem about the content of imagining. It's not about not being able to come up with the relevant details of the circumstances of other people. The problems that are raised by Jones, by Young, are about how we engage in these exercises of imagination. It's about how we come to summon what we take to be the relevant mental states that are involved in these exercises of experiential imagination. And the problem is that this how exercise, the exercise is performed completely depends on our embodiment. So for example, Katrina Mackenzie and Jackie Scully argue that the situated body structures and organizes cognition. And of course, this includes imagination. And likewise, we have argued in the paper that Guy mentioned at the beginning, we have argued that experiential imagination is embodied precisely because of how it depends on our situated history of sensory, motor, and affective interactions. And so the idea is that experiential imagination is basically piggybacking on our sensory, motor, and affective history. And so we're going to rely on, our own sensory motor skills. We're going to rely on our own affective predispositions to shape how we engage with these scenarios in imagination. So what are the consequences of these kinds of arguments about embodied imagination for the cognitive and the ethical values of art? What we think is that actually they just, bring the picture into a standstill. Because recall that, as we said at the beginning, both the cognitive and the ethical value claims require that we engage in empathetic experiential imagination. We said it's about imagining being someone other who is responding to these different circumstances. But in the characterization that I just presented of experiential imagination as embodied, what that tells us is that it's actually constrained by our own, history in such a way that it doesn't really support this imagining being someone other. We experientially imagine from the experiences we have been through. We experientially imagine from our own affective predispositions. And so if when we engage with art, we deploy these kinds of exercises of experiential imagination, then it doesn't look like our engagement with art is going to do much in expanding our understanding of others who are not like us in the relevant aspects. And we want to emphasize that the problem is not that we can't imagine. We certainly can. The problem is whether we can imagine it accurately and whether the result is going to be this improved understanding of other agents who are in these different positions. And again, we want to emphasize that the cases in which this kind of understanding has been invoked as being needed the most are precisely cases that involve the perspective of someone who is in a radically different position, which is just going to make these problems be more salient. Now, of course, this claim that imagination is embodied doesn't leave us with a completely pessimistic outlook when it comes to cognitive value. right? So the embodied approach actually allows that because imagination is embodied, it can enable the exploration of these novel interactions by building up on our experiences. But the worry is that perhaps we have been mischaracterizing the cognitive gains because it looks like at best art is just going to offer this better understanding of ourselves, and it might help us in exercising the skills that we already have, our empathizing, our mentalizing skills. So the embodied approach to imagination might indeed offer some sort of support to the idea that we can get practical or experiential knowledge as long as we're clear on the fact that it's about knowledge about oneself. But as we have left it so far, the embodied approach to imagination definitely leaves us with this pessimistic outlook when it comes to interpersonal understanding. And this is important because if we remove interpersonal understanding, then it might be that moral understanding about the import of the circumstances of other agents, that might be off the table as well. And furthermore, it might be that if artworks are cognitively valuable because they improve our own self-understanding, then there is the risk that these might make us less understanding of people with different perspectives, as it has been argued by Donnelly. And of course, this pessimism about the cognitive value of art when it comes to interpersonal and moral understanding, that might just lead to pessimism about ethical value. Because, without this interpersonal understanding, presumably we're not going to get to the kind of moral recognition and acknowledgement that we expected. And actually, Catherine Tolman argues that in these cases, empathy and perspective taking might become these epistemically oppressive practices because it might just threaten the epistemic authority of other agents, and it might just leave us completely unresponsive to their needs. So it looks like pessimism is the result of this embodied approach. But of course, there seems to be a very straightforward reply to this kind of pessimism, which is that experiential imagination is not all or nothing. Experiential knowledge, interpersonal understanding, these are not success terms, right? So for example, Anthony Omen points out that actually experiential knowledge is gradable. So an answer to the question of what it is like for others, that has many parts. So we might be able to get to know some parts, even if we might not be able to access some other parts. So, sure, experiential imagination is constrained, but it still gets us close enough. And it especially gets us close enough in the case of art, precisely because we have artworks to guide these exercises of experiential imagination. Because on the one hand, the fact that we have artworks to guide us mean that we can engage in what Amy Kind calls imaginative scaffolding. I can just put together in imagination different things that I have definitely experienced. I can combine them, and then I can get closer to what the artwork is inviting me to imagine. And according to Oman, artworks are in a very good position to engage in this kind of imaginative scaffolding because they can draw on our memories to, identify the atomic parts of an experience. It can guide us in how to combine these different atomic parts of an experience to build up the relevant perspective. And furthermore, he says, precisely because artworks engage our experiential imagination, then it's not just going to be about the propositional states, but they're really going to prompt all the relevant physiological and affective and cognitive states, and therefore they're in a very good position to recreate this phenomenal quality of the what it is like. And so in this way, art is valuable precisely because it offers this good enough answer to this question of what it is like for other agents. And this takes us to a second available reply to this pessimism, which is that the criteria to determine if our imaginative exercises are good enough, if they're close enough, depends on the specific exercise for which we deploy them, and they depend also on the specific epistemic context. And as we saw in the first section, in this particular epistemic context, our goals for this imaginative engagement they are really very general, right? So we're trying to grasp what counts morally. We're trying to get at the real quality of human nature. We're trying to get at the common humanity. And so for these goals, we might say we don't really need 100% accuracy. In fact, if we're trying to track what is common, what is shared, then in those cases, just putting together similar experiences in imagination, that has to be good enough. And again, it seems like what we're after is the shareability of experience. And of course, as Aristotle tells us, right, poetry is more philosophical and more elevated than history because poetry relates more of the universal, while history relates the particulars. Now, these might all be true. If we set a bunch of caveats on what imagination might deliver, we can be humble perhaps about the epistemic gains. We can build on what we have in common. We can assume this shareability of experience. But our worry is that actually this is a misguided way to respond to pessimism because it's not really addressing the problem. Because all of these caveats that we might put on what to expect from art, these caveats depend on the projection of sameness. They depend on commonality. They depend on shared experiences. And they do so at the expense of the differences. But if we go back to Jung, if we go back to Jones, their arguments and their criticisms point to the fact that differences are the point, right? So what they want to highlight is that what is of moral import are the differences that result from injustice, the differences that result from oppression, right? What they want to point out is that it is in the face of these differences that our understanding is lacking. It is in the face of these differences that our ethical responsiveness is lacking. And it's also important to point out that even people like Oman, who are going to argue for taking as a starting point commonality and shareability, they are still going to grant that there are certain things about experiences and about perspectives that cannot be replicated by imagination. So for example, Oman points to the everydayness, to the death by 1,000 cuts, to the inescapability of experience, right? But what Jones and Young and Mackenzie and Scully are trying to point out is that this inescapability, that's just not one among the many features that make up a perspective, that is part of its constitutive aspect. And so the idea is that if we miss out on these aspects, we are really missing out on a constitutive aspect of the perspective that we're attempting to understand. And so again, the idea is that it is in the things that we don't share that this lack of understanding is born. And finally, we want to point out that there's another risk in just pushing through with optimism, which is that if we keep placing this emphasis on shareability, there's a risk that we place this unreasonable demand on art from oppressed perspectives, which is the demand that instead of speaking from the specificity of their experience, they need to cater to our common humanity if they want to motivate our acknowledgement. They need to cater to this common humanity if they want to motivate our moral concern. Okay, so what do we do then? What we want to do is to take pessimism as a starting point. So instead of trying to come up with a bunch of caveats to push through with optimism, what we want to explore is what would happen if we just came to terms with our imaginative failures. And we think that part of what optimism got wrong is that we started off from the wrong assumption. This idea that poetry expresses what is universal because it relates what might happen full stop. And we think that the problem is that this kind of assumption is inconsistent, not just with what experiential imagination can deliver, but it is actually inconsistent with what art does, and it's inconsistent with what ethical responsiveness entails and what acknowledgement entails. So instead of Aristotle, we say, let's go back to the symposium. So in the symposium, Plato's Socrates highlights that the followers of wisdom are neither the wise nor the ignorant. So we want to take this insight and we want to drive attention to two aspects. The first is the relevance of knowing what we don't know. Because in knowing what we don't know, that is how we are motivated to seek this knowledge out. And the second is the relevance of the lack of satisfaction of the desire to know, because if we took the desire to be satisfied, then we would just stop seeking knowledge out. And we think that if we apply these insights to the case of artworks, what it turns out is that cognitive value is less about what we can imagine and more about what we cannot imagine. And here we want to emphasize that the engagement with artworks is not exhausted by experiential imagination. We like to make a lot about the role that experiential imagination plays, but that's not all we're doing, right? We propositionally imagine. We imagine that certain things are the case. And we think that this is crucial when it comes to artworks that prescribe this perspective that differs from our own, because it turns out that all of the things that we cannot imagine from this first person perspective, it's fine. We can just stipulate those aspects by means of propositional imagination. And so what we think this means is that we really shouldn't be thinking about our engagement with artworks as these exercises of perspective taking that aim at this first person apprehension of someone else's perspective and someone else's circumstances. But instead, we should be thinking about our engagement with artworks as these exercises in listening. We pay attention to what these perspectives are telling us about these different patterns of salience from their experience in the world. And this is where we think that the figure of prophets and the notion of bearing witness can come in handy. So if we go back to the original sense of bearing witness in Christianity, bearing witness actually makes reference to giving testimony of that which cannot be experienced directly by others. So it turns out that in the original picture of bearing witness, inaccessibility is a feature, it's not a bug. And so in the case of artworks, we might say that they bear witness to the concreteness of someone, to the concreteness of a different perspective. A perspective and a concreteness that might be inaccessible. And this is where we want to draw attention to Paul Lynch and how he thinks about prophets in his novel Prophet Song. So he says, what is sung by the prophets is but the same song sung across time. And the prophet sings not of the end of the world, but of what has been done and what will be done and what is being done to some, but not others. That the world is always ending over and over again in one place but not another, and that the end of the world is always a local event. It comes to your country and visits your town and knocks on the door of your house and becomes to others but some distant warning, a brief report on the news, an echo of events that has passed into folklore. So what we think is that this reveals that we started off from the wrong assumption, because artworks don't recount what might happen full stop, right? They recount what happens to some, but not others. And they precisely offer access, they bear witness to an end of the world that is always a local event. And so here is where we think the most important part comes in, which is that when it comes to perspectives that are different from our own, what we are offered is something that we cannot imagine from a first-person perspective. There is this mismatch. And so what we want to propose is that we focus on, the experience and the value of artworks by dwelling on this mismatch, by dwelling on this tension between imaginability and unimaginability. And this is where we think we might re-understand the cognitive value of art. Because if we go back to how acknowledgement was originally introduced, for example, by John, the idea was about coming alive to concrete patterns of value, right? It was about coming alive to the particularities of someone else's orientation to the world. So it was always meant to be an acknowledgement of the concrete. It was not meant to be an acknowledgement of the common humanity. And so we think that the cognitive value of artworks that dwell on this tension between imaginability and unimaginability really relies on this acknowledgement that, there are some experiences and there are some perspectives that are at a step removed from us, that are removed not just from how we experience the world, but that are so far removed that we cannot even imagine them. And so it's really about an acknowledgement of the space between these two incommensurable perspectives. And the idea is that by attending to the perspective that is offered without experiential imagination, that's how I come to know what I don't know. And more importantly, because I want to know what I don't know, I keep coming back to engage with the perspective. So there's no identification because what there is an acknowledgement of the concrete. That is, we think, the cognitive gain. And this brings us to what we think are the ethical gains. Because we think that the ethical value of artworks in this picture is not about exercising our empathizing skills, but it's again about getting us to acknowledge this incommensurability of perspectives, when it comes to those who are differently situated. And in this case, what we think is that we need to develop this ethical responsiveness that involves coming alive not to human interests in general, but about coming alive to the concrete interests and plights of others, even in the absence of identification. So in this picture, compassion is motivated by the acknowledgement that there are some other agents who are like me, but whose experience of the world is not just that I cannot understand it, is that I cannot even imagine it. And again, if we place this emphasis on the limits of our own imaginative capacities, the idea is that we really come to see the relevance of the second person perspective. We come to see the value of listening and the value of centering the voices of those whose experiences we aim to understand. And again, it's an ethical duty that is about coming to terms with the fact that their experiences are unlike ours. So this is where we think the ethical value, relies in highlighting the limits of our own embodied capacities and our own perspectives, and more importantly, in highlighting that there are cases in which trust in the absence of this first personal access is not just warranted, but it's required. And again, the idea is that in knowing what we don't know and in acknowledging that we don't know it, that's how we should be motivated to listen. So to conclude, let me just go back to Hamad and to this idea that what makes art valuable is this confrontation with otherness and this confrontation with our own limitations in trying to make sense of this otherness. And again, we want to emphasize this idea that the anagnorisis that results from our engagement with art is not about recognizing and coming to know what was previously unknown, but again, it's a reversal. Is the recognition of what we thought we knew as the unknown, of the familiar as the stranger. And she says that literary anagnorisis feels most truthful when it is not redemptive, when it instead stages a troubling limitation or wrongness. And she thinks that we should be fine with this way of understanding anagnorisis because she says anagnorisis marks the middle of the story and not the finale. Another act must follow. And so what we want to close with is this idea that in the picture that we're trying to propose here, that other act that should follow should be appreciator's actual encounter with the other with the aim of listening. And so the idea is that art is valuable insofar as it opens the picture, the door and points to the way, but it's appreciators who need to actually do the heavy lifting and the work. Okay, so that's it.
Thank you, Adriana, and thank you, Jimena. Extremely exciting. Thank you. It was rhetorically so exciting as well as philosophically, in the sense of so many swings in the. I was wondering if you're going to introduce a kind of cliffhanger and just leave us all there as a but, and you'll have to wait and see what we're going to conclude. But that was a very exciting conclusion. I imagine there are lots of questions. So please do use the raise hand function. And if you can't find it, then just wave energetically. But I thought, Jimena, if you wanted to add something, just following everything in the presentation briefly, then you, of course, have a right to the floor first.
No, I think I really want to listen to everyone's questions and feedback. I think
Great.
I'll
Well,
jump.
thank you so much. So, John, I have your hand.
Yeah. I'll ask a simple question. That was wonderful. There's so much to think about there. So I'm not going to be able to pose a question that is respectful of all the complications and nuances in your argument. There's a lot to think about, but that was amazing. So what's interesting about one way of thinking about the debate on cognitive value of art is everyone's trying to identify that particular epistemic oomph we feel like we experience when engaging with a work of art. And those who believe in a kind of positive cognitive value think it's the deliverance of some fantastically interesting proposition. You take what in the continental tradition gets called a negative approach, right? It's disruptive, or it's not the deliverance of some proposition that gives us a content to be understood, but it disrupts our sense that we understand the world as well as we once did, or it throws a wrench in our conceptual schemes or habits of thinking about the world and so forth. What's interesting about your talk, I'm completely with you on that. I think that's really powerfully argued, and it's a really important part. And I think it's essential to agree with something like that to get on the right side of, especially of the last century, works of art with political and moral ambitions. Think of Kafka. It's not offering a positive insight. It's what does he put? What's his line? I write novels that act as axes, right? That's a very different view. But often when you have that model, you begin with the point you make, but you build on it, right? So that might be Peter Kivy or Noel Carroll when they talk about the reflective aftermath of our encounter with the work of art. We don't just rest with this disruption or the limitations of our knowledge, but we try to overcome what it prevents us from understanding others as well as we would like. And that kind of comes out, and I'm going to stop with this because I'm going on too long. That tension might be in your paper in this respect. I think I hear you saying we have to acknowledge, absolutely right, that our experiences are unlike ours, absolutely. But then you go on to say we're trying to understand, we're trying to listen, we're trying to hear their voice, which means we're trying to get what they're trying to communicate in some sense. We're not going to just sit with our limitations and our sense of solitude and our own ignorance. We're going to use the work of art to prompt some sort of reflection, perhaps, or engagement or attempt to get at that positive thing. I'll stop with that. That was too long in any case, but thank you. What a wonderful paper.
No, thank you so much. And I think, yeah, because I think there is this, I think there's always this temptation, even when you start with something like, no, let's just disrupt this. There's always that temptation to, by the end, to say, well, this is what is happening. And I think, so in the case of this paper, this is part of a larger project that Jimena and I are working on, precisely on the importance of the second person perspective. Because the idea is that if the resulting view is one in which we end up, understanding in the aftermath of our engagement with art, we might just fall trap to the same kind of issues, right? It's just that we didn't do it as we were reading, but it was, the result of this reflection. And I think what we want to push back is this idea that that's something that we're ever going to accomplish alone. And so this idea is that the same thing that you're doing when it comes to art, this idea of trying to understand, that is what you should be doing when you engage with others in dialogue. And I think poor Jimena, because for me, as you were talking, I was thinking about Adorno. I think I've been reading way too much Adorno, and this idea that no, it's the non-identity. Let's not just fall prey to our vices. But I also think, in a closer tradition to Jimena and I, we think about Sor Juana, for example, and how she thinks about knowledge as this. It's not skepticism, but it's also not about, actually getting to know anything. It's just this in-betweenness where just keep coming back and coming back. And I think what we want to point to is this idea that the coming back, in the case of artworks, needs to go to our actual interactions with other agents. I don't know if Jimena wants to say anything else.
Yeah, no, I can just add to that precisely one of the things that got my attention from your comment, which thank you very much, is also the fact that indeed, we're not proposing, and because it would be a very similar picture to what we're trying to resist, we're not proposing that we arrive at this like positive propositional knowledge, right? But actually, the interesting thing, or that what we find very interesting, is also this tension, especially when you turn to the second order or the second person perspective, where you actually have some of that propositional knowledge. Someone tell you, no, this is what it is like, this is what happened, this is what I lived through. And there is this mismatch between what you're positing via experiential imagination, trying to come up with what it is like, and then you encounter that mismatch. And sometimes it is a mismatch between actual propositional information you have there, or propositional knowledge you have there, and something that doesn't match the way you're thinking about the experience. And then you are left in that tension. And that's why I just want to reiterate how important it is, or how much it happens with great works of art, that they just leave you hanging and going back and not actually understanding anything, and just going back and insisting on something and not quite getting it, right? But then going back to the point about what's the epistemic gain, if we think more widely about that epistemic gain, well, it might be a gain in just, I'm thinking right now of virtue epistemology. Maybe it's something different, right? It's the value of curiosity, the value of, I'll just keep searching and see what I find. But it's the epistemic gain is, yeah, the propositional knowledge might be there, but the problem is that it doesn't match with what you're imagining.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. We have at least 5 more questions to go, and considering that there may be at least 2 answers to each of those questions, and we have 13 minutes, we can go over time, but we should respect at least the nominal time. We should keep the questions brief, and I'm aware that when I say that, I'm throwing stones in glass houses. But Elizabeth, you're next.
Good, thank you. Thank you both very much. I love the paper. I'm not entirely convinced that it's experiential imagination which does all the work that you describe, but that's like a separate issue. What I really wanted to ask you about it is really how do we give a kind of shape, or how do we articulate this idea that we know what we don't know? I could see that we could know that there is a tension between the imaginable and the unimaginable. I could see that we could know where the limits of our knowledge lies. But why would that not be enough? Why would we need to say, I know that there is some, I know that there is something I don't know? It sounds like some of the things you're describing, and I totally agree with the phenomenology in the context of art and so on, but you might just think it might be more knowledge to do with really like, how far my knowledge or understanding really stretches to, or goes to, like where the end point, as it were, is for the moment in the current state, rather than knowing what I don't know in that way. Yeah.
I think, thank you, Elizabeth. I think this is part of maybe where we have to think about more. But I think the start of an answer is what Jimena said before, this idea that there might be some kind of knowledge, if you think about it in terms of propositional knowledge, right? But the thing is that if what we get at is some kind of propositional knowledge about the circumstances of other agents, it might be that it doesn't fulfill that that condition of finding the real oomph of what makes art, qua art, valuable, right? It might be that we get this kind of propositional knowledge in better ways from different sources. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is that in the literature on testimony, there is a role that experiential, or that at least perspective taking, remains playing there, which is that part of what grounds our trust in testimony is this idea that when we run through the simulation in this perspective taking, we can arrive at the same thing. And I think this connects with Olivia Bailey's insight that actually in some cases what we find is that trust in the absence of this first personal apprehension is actually warranted. So, the epistemic gain that we're thinking about perhaps lies in this idea, this knowing what we don't know is this, we get to some kind of propositional knowledge by attending to other agents, even if we cannot actually, give any kind of grounds from a first person apprehension of the reasons or something like that. But we have to think about it more.
Thank you so much.
Great. Then we'll move on to Karen, who was the next with the hand.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful project. And I think, as you know, I'm very sympathetic to your challenge to empathic understanding and inhabiting perspective, and in favor of a second person model for thinking about our relationship to art. So I love all of that. I have worries that are related to what's already been said. I'm not going to push them. I'm going to ask two quick questions about the way you get to your proposal. First, I'm a little bit worried about the way you draw on these imaginative constraints. I'm too worried that if you're right about that, we need not be only pessimistic about our knowledge of others and others' perspective, but even about our capacity to expand our own self-understanding, our own pursuit of life, who we are, because I take it that we often, our embodiment itself is historical and situated and continuously changing. I mean, if you live in Gaza right now, even if you have gone through atrocities before the war, you are in a crisis that requires sort of a different self-understanding and a different form of life. And I worry that the way you presented this imaginative constraint does not even allow us to expand beyond what we've already experienced. It's sort of the constraint is too strong in that sense. And I worry also that at the end of the day, it's not clear to me that you actually get to a second person model, partly because it seems to me you dismiss too quickly early on this idea that art actually guides us in a particular way. I think that is really important in our experience with art, especially with this, with this kind of really challenging novels that we often we really don't know our way about them, and yet they don't leave us speechless or ununderstanding. I mean, great works of art are precisely those that exemplify to us how to take them in, how to appreciate them, even though they seem so unfamiliar. So in that sense, they are offering us the perspective of another, not as the perspective that we should inhabit from our own first perspective, but as the perspective almost of another person who guides us, who gives us their self-understanding in a way that allows us to be in this kind of second personal exchange with them. And so these are my two main worries, and I wonder what you'll say about it. Really excited to hear that.
Thanks so much, Karen. So the first worry, I think it's a very fair worry. I don't know what I could say. I don't know if Jimena would like to say something about it, because I think it's something that we struggle with. And like I said, we're working on this project and we've been working on it for a while. And indeed, it seems like, sometimes we rely so much on imagination that what happens when we're left with this picture where everything just depends on our previous experiences. So I'm going to put a pin on that because I don't know what to say about it. To the second one, I think I absolutely agree with you. And I think we have to be clear that, so we dismiss this idea that artworks guide us only in the sense that they are guiding these imaginative scaffolding. Because precisely, I think you're right, that the kind of picture that we're trying to build is one in which works of art are very much like the second person who is guiding, our engagement by telling us, by relaying certain things. So I think that that definitely, we don't want to give the impression that we don't think that artworks are doing any guiding. We definitely think that we have to think about it in terms of a dialogue with these works of art. And as such, I think that what happens is what happens in any kind of dialogue when you're searching for a deeper kind of understanding, where it might be that you get certain things, and then when you go back, you're like, oh, actually, I don't think I got that, or maybe that's not what they meant, or and I think that's why we think about this idea that you're lured back engage with it. Yeah, we're trying to think about a second model of our engagement with art as well. So we don't want to dismiss that. And about the imagination worries, I don't know if Jimena wants to say anything about that.
I mean, very quickly, as Adriana said, this is a worry that we've been having, the implications of this idea, these constraints for self-knowledge. There is some evidence that we're not great. For instance, this is actually already mentioned and discussed by Scully and Mackenzie. Is it right here? Okay, I think. Anyway, the evidence is just the fact that in many cases where someone goes through a life-changing experience, for instance, coming up with a certain condition from one moment to the other, the prediction of what their life might be is actually quite different from what they expected themselves. So it might be there is some evidence that as it happens in some very radical circumstances, we're not actually great at predicting what our experience would be in those circumstances. But we definitely need to think about it more because there is a challenge in what concerns self-knowledge, which I think is very interesting, but very complicated.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Right. Iris.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I think I'm just gonna follow up on a few of the things that were mentioned so far. Now, I'm generally very happy to discuss cognitive value of art in terms of understanding. But it seems to me that, again, I have this impression now that you may be a bit too quick in discarding the cognitive value of art on the account that we can't reach understanding when the perspective of these people that we read about is too distant from us. Because it seems to me that there is still a value in coming to see that there are people who are so distant from us that we can't really understand them, but we still get the knowledge that there are, which can then be implemented into our daily life in the sense that, okay, so there are people like that, I should be, aware of what I do when I'm close to them, etc., etc. So why should we discard the value of art just because we can't reach this, as you presented it, it seems to me, very demanding task of really being able to fully kind of incorporate these distant experiences? And also just a quick follow-up. How much of the kind of the first model that you presented as an explanation, in the sense that we are trying to reach the common humanity and then we can just get close enough? I mean, would you reject that entirely, or is there still some value to that? Because it seems to me that just to claim that, so through reading works of art, now I see how much I don't understand and how much I don't know, it doesn't really match the experience. And you quoted John quite extensively, so I'm going to follow up on that, when he says that we turn to art because we recognize the archive of human experience. So it seems to me that quite a lot of our intuition about what it is that art gives us is lost if we really get the sense that, I don't know this and I don't know that, and I can't understand this and I can't understand that. So is that a problem for your theory, or am I maybe misunderstanding some of your claims? But thank you. It's a very, very interesting and provoking project.
Thank you very much. No, I think this gives us, the chance to clarify a couple of things. So one is that we want to offer this optimistic pessimism because we don't want to say that there's no value in art. Precisely, we're trying to think about how to basically have our cake and eat it too. And so precisely what we're trying to identify is what could be the cognitive value if it looks like we were on the wrong track by thinking that we get this first personal access to the circumstances of others. And so as Jimena said before, I think it might be that this idea of knowing what we don't know, it might be that part of what is striking is this kind of propositional knowledge, knowing that there are agents who face these kind of circumstances. And then the worry is that if, for example, again, I'm going to turn to John, when we are thinking about the cognitive value of art, it looks like the kind of cognitive value that we expect to identify is one that is best delivered by art qua art. And if we start placing so much emphasis on propositional knowledge, then it turns out that the propositional knowledge about the circumstances of, for example, the child refugees crossing the Mexico-US border, I'm not going to get that reading Valeria Luiselli, right? If I want to know about what is going on, and if I want to get this propositional knowledge, I'll be in a much better position just looking elsewhere and not in art. So again, it might be that there's some role for propositional knowledge, but the risk is that if we overemphasize it, it's not something that art is in a best position to deliver qua art. So that would be one thing. The other thing is that so I think maybe we're referring to two different Youngs. So I think Iris Young precisely will want to deny this idea of the common humanity. And I think what she would want to say, emphasize is again, this idea that when we live in oppressive circumstances, such as the ones that we inhabit, this idea of common humanity that should make us very suspicious. And instead, if we're trying to tackle these kinds of injustices, we're better off moving away from this common humanity and focusing on the concreteness of someone else. So again, we're trying to see if there's anything that art would be in a best position to offer, given that we have to be suspicious, we think, about these common humanity claims.
To Vid, who's going to ask a question.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm really sympathetic to. I was never that inclined to go with the kind of full knowledge what it's like claims, and I think you identify really well, some of the concerns that I certainly have felt. So in terms of my question, it seems to me you're kind of maybe searching for a kind of a third term, sort of between ignorance and kind of epistemic success or knowledge. Because at some point you said something like, we have to keep listening even to these experiences which we could never imagine, right? And that seems sort of paradoxical, because if what we're trying to do when we're listening is to find out about them, but we never can, then why would we keep listening? So maybe, maybe what would be useful is to have a kind of characterization of what is the best possible epistemic place that the person doing the listening could ever get into. So maybe it's never knowledge, but maybe it's some kind of thoughtfulness, or maybe it's some kind of approximation. So I guess my question for you is, if I have one perspective and the person I'm listening to has an alien perspective, what's the best that I can hope for epistemically?
That is such a good question. Thanks, Vid. So I think maybe going back to something that Jimena said before, maybe what we're trying to track is something. If we think about virtue epistemology, or maybe we're trying to track some kind of attitude of inquiry that will make us sensitive. So I think I like this idea of thoughtfulness. So Jimena had mentioned curiosity before, but I think we need to think about it more, because I think you're right that if we want to fully capture what is this in betweenness, it might be that we need something, because definitely. So again, I've just been thinking a lot about Sor Juana lately, but in this I just want to encourage you to read it. This beautiful poem that she has that is called "The First Dream," where she's basically advancing her theory of knowledge. It's basically this story of how the soul tries to, achieve knowledge, and it fails, and it comes back all defeated, and then, the following day it tries again. And I think that's the kind of movement that we're trying to capture. So I think we will have to think about what kind of attitude of inquiry might be able to track this idea of. Yes, it's not quite ignorance, because I think you're right that might just close off dialogue, right? If we cannot understand each other, then why bother? But then there has to be something that captures this luring back. So we'll have to think about it. But thank you.
Excellent. So lastly, not leastly, but briefly, Arata.
So I'm very sympathetic. I found your presentation really super stimulating. So I'm just wondering how the block on or the difficulty of imagining what it's like to be another is connected to your argument that we should adopt something like a second person standpoint, or we should frame our relation to the other in terms of the second person. Because it seems like it's like what's essential. It seemed like part of what's essential to your placing our relation to the other in terms of the second person is the idea of you're being in a conversation or dialogue with them, and so you're recognizing that they have something to say, and it doesn't seem like a block, like the incapacity to imagine what it's like to be them um, is connected to this acknowledgement of you're being in a second person relation with them. And so I'm just wondering why you couldn't view works of art as already in the second person context without making the point about imagination at all, because after all we can't you don't even have to be that different from another person. Other people are simply, in a sense, it is simply difficult even to imagine, like for me to imagine what it's like to be Karen, um, and so I'm just wondering how the block on imagine, or the limit on imagination, and in the second person idea, which I'm very sympathetic to the second person framework that you want to use. I'm just wondering how those are connected.
Thanks so much, Arata. I think so. And it might be that we have to go back to this picture that has been proposed by these other aestheticians about these cognitive gains, because it looks like imagination enters the picture, because when we try to capture that particular cognitive gain that is best offered by art, qua art, part of how we get to that unique knowledge or understanding is via the imagination. So if we try to make sense of what art is offering, in many cases it's cashed out in terms of like this experiential knowledge, and this experiential knowledge precisely you get at via the imagination. So what we're trying to say is, look, implicit in these ways of understanding the cognitive value, you have to get to that via the imagination. If it turns out that the imagination has all of these problems, then you're not going to get to the kinds of cognitive gains that you want. And I think this is related to other literature related to testimony, for example, and interpersonal understanding in other contexts, where they do the same move to get to interpersonal understanding by means of this perspective taking. And so there's Amy Copeland, for example, who writes about empathy. She says that the mind is like this ghostly Robinson Crusoe, and that the way that you cross, you escape that isolation is via the imagination and via empathy. And that's why empathy is so important. And what we're trying to point out is that, we start with from the wrong assumption if we think that imagination is the only way to gain this interpersonal knowledge. And in the case of art, we start from the wrong assumption if we think that we engage with art by these exercises of perspective taking, when it might be that what's actually happening is this kind of dialogue or this second person model. And so what we want to do is to show that the assumption of imagination is lurking there in the background. We think that it's problematic, and that if we instead turn to these other models that have been offered, these second personal models, we might be able to get at that uniqueness perhaps of what art offers. I don't know. I hope that made sense.
Yes, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you particularly, Adriana and Jimena, for the really, really exciting and stimulating paper. Look forward to seeing people after the Christmas or holiday break. And wonderful. I think a round of applause, probably virtual applause, for Adriana and Jimena. And thanks for coming.
No, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for your questions and for the invitation. And I hope you all have a nice winter break.
Likewise, thank you so much. Have a nice break.
Thank you so much. All the best,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.